Hello, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the International Spy Museum. Thank you for joining us tonight for The Eagle in the Mirror with Jesse Fink. We are so excited to have him here to talk about his new book. And Jesse's going to be interviewed by our own historian and curator, Dr. Andrew Hammond. Andrew will be giving a formal introduction to Jesse in just a moment. But I wanted to let you know we're excited because we're doing both in-person and virtual streaming live. So this is really nice for us to be able to get our program out to anyone who's interested, not just the folks who can get here into our theater. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and to Jesse. They're going to come up and join us on stage. And I will tell you that afterward, Jesse will be signing books in the hallway, and he can also send out signed books if you buy them online, if you're virtual. Thanks. Is that enough of a commercial, guys?
Thanks. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you all and to do a hybrid program, which I'm very excited about. So just a quick introduction to Jesse. So one of the things that I sort of love but also hate about my job is that when you introduce people on stages like this, they really make you feel like an underachiever. So Jesse's written more than a few books. They've been translated into 13 different languages. Amongst other things, he worked for 5 years as the senior non-fiction editor for HarperCollins Australia. So if anybody's thinking of writing a book, this man has edited them, written them, seen all sides of the ecosystem. And some of the books that he's written are really fascinating. Twin biographies on AC/DC, the band. So one on the Young brothers, Malcolm and Angus, and the other one on Bon Scott. All three of whom, I think I'm right in saying, were born in God's own country, Scotland, before they moved to Australia to go on to better things. So tonight we're going to discuss The Eagle in the Mirror, and thanks again for joining us here. So it's a pleasure to speak to you, Jesse.
Great to be here. Thanks for everyone coming tonight.
And I thought a good place to start off would be, how did you stumble across this story? There's a really nice vignette about how you came across it.
I had finished my fifth book, Pure Narco, which was about cocaine trafficking in Miami, and had worked on it for about 3 years, so it had been sort of a massive project for me. It was about a 600-page book. And then the pandemic hit, which was terrible timing. It meant that I couldn't leave Australia. The guy that I had worked with couldn't come to Australia to promote it. The Australian government wouldn't let us leave the country. We were stuck in Sydney. And the only thing that really the government would allow us to do was go shopping at the supermarket or go to charity shops. And so I was spending a lot of time actually visiting my father in a charity shop. And we were spending a lot of time going over the second-hand books on the shelves, and he picked up an old copy of A Man Called Intrepid, which was a bestseller in the 70s, went on to sell about 8 million copies, which was about a Canadian fellow called William Stevenson. And my father said, check out this guy, Dick Ellis. He sounds pretty fascinating. And I hadn't heard of Dick Ellis. He was William Stevenson's deputy at an organisation called British Security Coordination in New York City in the early 40s, which was an MI6 station set up by the British ostensibly to get the Americans into the war. And Dick Ellis had written the foreword to A Man Called Intrepid, which came out in 1976. So this was a year after Ellis died in England in 1975. And what was also fascinating was that Dick Ellis came from the same suburb where my father lived in Sydney. But I knew nothing about him. And when I looked at what had been written about Ellis, like on Wikipedia and in the several sort of scattered mentions of him that were on the internet, I thought, well, this guy's had a fascinating life. And I couldn't believe anyone hadn't attempted to write a biography of Ellis. So I suggested it to my publisher and they went for it.
And I think now that we have the main character of this story, Dick Ellis, I just want to put out there that this is someone, and part of the book is about this. This is someone that's been accused of being a spy. Well, he was an intelligence officer for the British, for MI6, but he's accused of also being a spy for Nazi Germany and for the Soviet Union. So we're going to leave that there and come back to the evidence that Jesse uncovered in that journey. But that's who we're talking about. So tell our audience a little bit more. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? Where did he grow up?
So he was born in Annandale in Sydney, which is a sort of a nice leafy suburb of Sydney now, but was a pretty sort of poor area back in 1895 when he was born. And his mother died when he was 3, so he was raised by his father, who was a pretty poor man. And he had a brother, and they were kind of sent to different households, different farms, sort of up and down the sort of the coast of Australia, because his father really couldn't take care of his kids. So he had a very sort of interrupted education, a very poor education. He met a very kindly schoolmaster who sort of took him under his wing and started educating him. He learned how to play several instruments, and as a young man he was playing cello and oboe in classical orchestras in Melbourne. And he started attending night courses at the University of Melbourne just to better himself, and was such a good student that he was offered a scholarship to go to England. And then he took the first opportunity he could get and booked a passage to London in 1914, and obviously there was a very significant event that year, which was the outbreak of the First World War. So Ellis finds himself enlisting in the British Army, and he's sent out to the Western Front. He gets injured several times fighting, and then spends some time convalescing actually in Scotland at one point. And he started studying Russian, and he was picked up by the intelligence corps of the British Army and sort of ended up going to Oxford, where he continued his Russian studies, and there he was recruited by MI6 and sent out to Turkey. So that was really the start of his intelligence career.
When I was reading your book, it made me think William Stevenson and Dick Ellis, they were part of this generation who were, I guess in many ways, unlucky enough to come of age for the First World War, but then also to be sort of middle or senior managers for the Second World War. So that's quite fascinating, these two lives that span these two huge global conflagrations. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, when you look at Ellis's CV, what he was involved in, it wasn't just the First World War and the Second World War, it was the Russian Civil War, it was the Cold War,
Anglo-Afghan
War, and during the course of which he ends up learning about 8 or 9 languages fluently. So he has this incredible facility for language, which is obviously incredibly useful to an intelligence service.
Another overachiever.
And so in the 1920s, he goes from Turkey to Berlin. So he goes to Berlin in 1923, and then in 1926 he goes to Vienna, and then Geneva, and then he's back in England in the early 30s, and I've skipped over a bit where he actually manages to write a huge 600-page book on the League of Nations in 1928. So he was working under the cover of a journalist for the Morning Post newspaper in London. And then in the 30s, he's sort of based in London, but he's sort of heading back to Europe quite a lot because obviously in 1933, the Nazis came into power and suddenly there wasn't just, sort of one threat to Britain being the Soviet Union, there was Nazi Germany. So he was kind of working on two targets at the same time.
And in World War I, he pulls himself up by the bootstraps. He goes from private to captain, and he gets picked up by the intelligence corps, and he's involved in several conflicts after the First World War ends. Tell us how he gets picked up by British intelligence proper.
As I said, he was at Oxford University studying Russian, and English universities that are a fairly kind of sort of fertile breeding ground for wannabe agents. You probably know all about the Cambridge spies. Oxford doesn't have the same kind of reputation in the intelligence world, but Ellis was picked up by MI6 there. He was sent out to Turkey, and he, because of his facility for languages, he was sort of dispatched to so many different stations in Europe during that time, and the most important, I guess, was his time in Germany.
And there's a great quote that I came across. He was the very model of eccentric creativity essential to any successful intelligence service. Tell us a little bit more about his eccentricities.
Well, he was a scholar of Central Asia, so he had spent obviously a lot of time there while he was a soldier. I also skipped over a bit where he was accused of being involved in a massacre of 26 communists in Central Asia. And it was said, legend had it that Stalin regarded Dick Ellis as his number one enemy and wanted Dick Ellis's head on a platter for his role in this massacre. And there's actually a very famous painting, which I'll show you. Oh, so this is Dick Ellis when he was a young man. This is his time as a musician. That's him with the at front. There he is there again. Going off to war. That's what was that? On his way to India. And so this famous painting, the execution of the 26 Baku commissars from 1925. Dick Ellis was supposed to be one of the British soldiers that you can see at the left of the painting, and which was not true. He wasn't there, and he established that. He actually wrote a book in the 60s where he denied any involvement in this particular massacre. But there was a guy with him called Reginald Teague Jones, who also was targeted by Stalin for his supposed involvement in this massacre, and he changed his name to Ronald Sinclair and sort of went into hiding for the rest of his life. And I'm skipping forward a little bit here, but Dick Ellis, when he came to America in 1940, and his cover job was British Consul of New York, Ronald Sinclair was appointed his deputy. He was Vice Consul in New York. So this idea of Dick Ellis working as a Soviet spy doesn't really hold up, because if Stalin really wanted to kill Ronald Sinclair, I think Dick Ellis would have given up his best mate to Russian assassins at the first opportunity, and it never happened.
So tell us a little bit more about the BSC. What was it? Why New York?
Well, obviously, the Second World War had broken out in 1939. The British were very keen on getting the Americans involved in the war, so they set up a station in New York that as I said before, was essentially designed to get the Americans into the war, but was pumping out sort of propaganda. They were kind of using newspapers to sort of warn of the great dangers that America faced. They had some very compliant newspaper editors who were sort of running these stories. They were monitoring sort of Allied shipping, looking for spies. They had a network of people who in the States who were kind of monitoring pro-Nazi groups in the United States. So it was a fairly sort of comprehensive sort of operation which employed hundreds of agents. And Dick Ellis was essentially running it with William Stevenson. And then in 1941 there was a famous incident where a British-German double agent called Dusko Popov was sent to the United States by Germany to gather information on Pearl Harbor. And a meeting took place with Popov, Ellis, some gentlemen from the FBI, where Popov warned of an impending attack on Pearl Harbor. This was like in August 1941, so it was many months before the actual attack. And if you read Popov's autobiography, he says that he had this meeting with J. Edgar Hoover and directly warned the head of the FBI that an attack was about to take place. But Hoover ordered Popov out of the room and said, "I don't want your kind here, you Serbian playboy, get out of here. And you're working for the Germans, I don't want to have anything to do with you." And that was Popov's take on what happened. So this idea that the Americans were warned about Pearl Harbor is sort of regarded as a bit of a conspiracy theory and sort of poo-pooed. But what was fascinating when I was researching the book was that I actually came across a transcript and some video footage of Dick Ellis, which was from Dick Ellis with William Stevenson. So that was his boss at BSC. And this was the footage that I found of Ellis, which I couldn't believe. It was the only sort of moving picture of Ellis I've ever seen. It's the only one that I'm aware of. But it was never aired, and it was a Canadian documentary about William Stevenson called A Man Called Intrepid. So this was before the book came out. It was obviously a documentary idea before it became a book. Ellis was interviewed, and in this interview he said, yes, we were warned about Pearl Harbor. Stevenson and I got a message to the President of the United States that it was about to happen, and we don't know exactly what happened or how it broke down, but we know that a message got there. And Roald Dahl, the famous children's author that you might all know of, was told the exact same story by Stevenson, that FDR had actually been warned about it. So it sort of tallied with what Popov was saying. So I think sort of more investigation and more openness sort of needs to take place around this whole issue of just how much the Americans knew about, the attack on Pearl Harbor before it happened.
Well, apart from us, I'm pretty sure most people in the audience are from the United States, so it could be good to dig into that a little bit more. Is there any archival documents that show that Popov and Hoover had this meeting? Is it mainly based on interviews and oral histories and so forth?
There's nothing that proves that Popov and Hoover actually met.
Okay.
But there are some documents. It was contained in a recent book by Larry Loftus, who did a book on Popov, where it showed that the FBI, in its preliminary meeting with Popov, had actually kind of done a summary of what Popov was warning, and they had sent it to Hoover. So the idea that Hoover never got this information, I don't think holds up.
Okay. And for FDR,
There's nothing that shows
nothing?
that
Okay.
FDR actually was warned,
Okay.
other than his testimony.
Okay. This is the problem
Yeah.
with intelligence history, right? Okay, so we've got the BSc, and tell me if I'm getting this right. It's New York City as opposed to DC because the press is critical, the media is critical.
Yes, it was a very...
And that's the centre of the publishing industry. And then it's also because it's a commercial, it's
and
the
the commercial
capital.
capital of the United States,
Okay,
yeah.
so that's why New York. Is there any of them in DC?
Well, Ellis was spending a lot of time shuttling between Washington and New York, and he was then also incredibly instrumental in setting up what became the OSS. So there is really a kind of, I guess, a dispute, about who actually sort of wrote the blueprint for what became the CIA, and some people will credit Ian Fleming, but Dick Ellis sort of poo-pooed that idea and said, no, it was me who actually did it. And but Ellis was very highly regarded within the American sort of intelligence community at that, the nascent American intelligence community at that time, and obviously had, the ear of some very important people in Washington who actually said, and there's a quote in the book, that he was running the OSS for Donovan. So it's remarkable to think, that this unknown Australian cellist had set up the OSS.
And I'm trying to remember the specific quote in the book, but there's one where one of the Americans is like, how do we have this bloody Australian cellist running American intelligence or something, right?
Yeah, along those lines.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is what was fascinating to me, that this person who's so sort of critical to, MI6 to the Americans and in future to the Australian sort of intelligence community is a completely unknown person, that he's just completely flown under the radar, and nothing had ever been written about him. But if you go into, a library of sort of espionage books, you will find like little mentions of Dick Ellis, just like scattered little mentions, but they're only just single mentions. So my job was kind of to gather all those little mentions together and try and piece together a timeline of his life that showed me kind of where he was at any particular time, and get an idea of exactly what he was doing. And that was, the hard part.
Well, let's zero in on that. So the idea of who wrote the blueprint for the coordinator of information,
Yes.
the Office of Strategic Services. So this is quite important because this is the birth of modern American intelligence as we know it. So what's the debate? Was it Ellis? Was it Fleming? What evidence do we have?
Well, there is actually like a 14-page sort of memorandum called Setting Up of a Secret Service Intelligence Organisation. I think that's the exact title, by Ellis. That is in it was in the actual the Churchill archives in Cambridge. So it struck me as fairly sort of plausible what he was claiming. I don't think it can be proved beyond a doubt, but it was fairly compelling, and especially given what some very important people in the OSS, in the American government, were actually saying about how critical Ellis was to the setting up of what became the OSS and then the CIA. So he was actively involved in setting up training centres for OSS personnel in Washington. He set up a camp called Camp X in Canada for the same purpose. He was regularly moving between London and Washington and New York and Canada throughout the early 1940s. He was obviously an extremely important person in the American intelligence sort of apparatus at that time. So I think it's a fairly kind of sound theory, but there's nothing definitive.
So I think it would be interesting now to discuss his post-war career and then we'll come back to whether or not he worked for the British, the Soviets, and the Nazis.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to structure this interview just to give you some inside information, like an Agatha Christie novel. So you wait until the end to find out who the suspects were and who was in the billiard room with the candlestick. So it's not Columbo where you find out at the beginning. Okay, so his post-war career, what does he do after the war?
So he's awarded the Legion of Merit by President Truman for his contribution to the American war effort in 1946. He receives a whole bunch of sort of honours from the British government. He then essentially is running MI6 in North America and the Far East. So he sort of goes out to Hong Kong. He's spending a lot of time out in Singapore, where obviously there was some sort of communist build-up going on at that time. And the Australians engage him for the setting up of what became the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, or the Secret Intelligence Service in that country. And then, sort of mysteriously, he pulls stumps on his contract in Australia and goes back to England. And this was around the time of the defection of a Russian called Vladimir Petrov. And this was sort of like an unusual thing that sort of Ellis did by sort of finishing his contract early, and his enemies saw this as perhaps sort of indicative of something that he was trying to hide, or that he was going back to Britain to warn Kim Philby that Vladimir Petrov was about to defect. So that's a whole other story, but this was very important. And then in the 1960s, he sort of went into semi-retirement pretty much, but was used by MI6 during this time to sort of go into the archives of MI6 and throw out any files that he didn't think that the organisation needed. So he was entrusted with this responsibility. And obviously a key event in espionage history is the defection of Kim Philby, who was a British agent to the Soviet Union in 1963. And then 2 years later, this is when Ellis was interrogated by MI5 and MI6 in London about allegations that he had been providing information to the Germans and was possibly a Soviet spy as well. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, he was involved with an anti-communist organisation called Interdoc, which was sort of pumping out anti-communist tracts to sort of counter, this propaganda that the Soviets were putting out. And then in the early 70s, he was by that time he was an old man, but he was still under this cloud of suspicion. So when he went back to Australia in I think it was 1973, he was being surveilled by ASIO. They sent out people to take photographs of him while he was going down to the local shops, dressed in his hat and looking like George Smiley. So these were actual surveillance photographs that took me 2 years to find of ASIO taking photographs of Dick Ellis going to the shops.
How did that feel when you found the photographs?
Oh, fantastic. It was amazing. Because they had spent 2 years basically trying to deny me access to these images. And then what happened was in the 1980s, so Ellis died in 1975. He was aged 80. And then in 1981, this British journalist called Chapman Pincher, very famous writer of sort of espionage stories in the UK, he wrote a book called Their Traitor's Treachery, where he basically told the story that Ellis was a Nazi and Soviet mole, and they published this photograph of Dick Ellis alongside a picture of Kim Philby, sort of making out that he was the traitor of the century, and that no one had a picture of Dick Ellis, so they sort of doctored this image of him from his book that he'd written about his time in Central Asia. So you can see it's not a very clear picture of Dick Ellis, but no one had a picture of him at the time. Mm-hmm. And then what happened was that another writer called Nigel West, he wrote a book detailing the allegations against Dick Ellis, and Peter Wright, who had been Chapman Pincher's primary source for his book, and was very annoyed that Chapman Pincher had made a lot of book from this information that Peter Wright was providing, went off and wrote a book called Spycatcher, which was an incredibly famous, very successful book that came out in 1987 that was published all around the world. The British government tried to stop publication, and as a result, it sort of became this runaway bestseller. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I just want to touch on a couple of things there before we move on to whether or not he was a mole for the Soviets and previously a Nazi spy. So Petrov, so this is a Soviet intelligence officer who basically walks into in Canberra and offers up information.
Yes, it was about to defect and was happy to provide information, and then Dick Ellis suddenly decides that I don't want to stay in Australia anymore, even though I'm on a sort of a multi-year contract to help with the Australian intelligence services. I'm going to go back to London and marry this woman. And then it turns out that the woman who he was supposed to marry denied that they were getting married, right? So questions were raised about actually what the real story was. So there was a theory that obviously that Ellis was trying to get in touch with Philby and warning that Petrov was about to defect and that he was going to spill the beans, and that obviously also Philby was compromised if this information came out. But my own investigation was that the timeline just didn't work, that there was no way that Ellis could have warned Philby in time.
And just briefly, two of the people that you have mentioned, Chapman Pincher, he's a British journalist. He's quite famous in the 70s and 80s and so forth. He makes lots of accusations. Occasionally he's correct, but more often than not, he's not. So I guess it's if you fire a shotgun at enough people, you're going to hit someone that's guilty. But he's sort of well known as like a controversial sort of, I guess the word would be gutter snipe, somebody who trashes reputations and kind of very lurid Fleet Street type accounts about scandal and so forth. Is that a fair way to describe him?
Yeah, I think someone described him as a sort of a public urinal for government MPs who wanted to get information out into the newspapers.
And Peter Wright, he's an MI5 counterintelligence officer who, in the early part of his career, he's quite successful. He tries to bring MI5 kicking and screaming into the modern age, but then sort of halfway through his career, he starts chasing ghosts and looking for Soviet moles all over the place, and he collaborates with Chapman Pincher. Spycatcher comes out. He accuses the head of MI5, Sir Roger Hollis, of being a Soviet mole. This has basically been disproved. Yeah. But that's the sort of overall context of where we are at the minute, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. So let's go on to the cliffhanger. Tell us a little bit more about the Zelensky Abwehr incident, and tell the audience just remind them who the Abwehr were.
Which was German military intelligence, and Dick Ellis, his first wife was a White Russian woman, not literally White Russian, but an anti-communist Russian from the Ukraine, or Ukraine, however you want to say it. And Zelensky, Alexei Zelensky, was her brother, and Dick Ellis was involved with really sort of trading information with Zelensky, who had sort of contacts within, sort of the enemy intelligence services. But at that time, Ellis was involved in really the selling of false information to these agents, this network of agents that he had in Europe at that time. And he was involved in this sort of very complicated horse trading, I guess, to gather, to find out what the enemy was interested in, and also to sort of pump false information to them. And there were payments going on between the two groups, and at some point, Ellis was accused of actually sort of taking money for some information that he had passed to his brother-in-law. And what happened was that after Kim Philby defected in '63 and Ellis was called into this interrogation in 1965, what happened was that MI5 started going through the files of old Nazis who had been captured and interrogated after the Second World War, and they came across an interrogation of a guy called Protzer, who was a deputy to Admiral Canaris, the famous head of the Abwehr in Germany, who was one of the plotters against Hitler. And in this interrogation report of Protzer, he had said that an important source for the Germans had been a man called Captain Ellis. So it wasn't Dick Ellis, it was a Captain Ellis. And but what was fascinating to me was that on the surface that appears like, oh my God, Ellis has actually kind of been involved in the selling of information to the Nazis. It's a slam dunk case. But what I sort of came to kind of believe through the research that I was doing and the documents that I was seeing and the sort of the mentions of Ellis and what he was doing prior to the war was that he was working on the instructions of the head of MI6, essentially to work with the Nazis against their common enemy, which at the time, which was the Soviet Union. So that there was some sort of level of cooperation going on. And Ellis's boss at MI6, a guy called Stuart Mingus, he was essentially collaborating with Canaris because they wanted to get rid of Hitler. And Dick Ellis, as Mingus's sort of right-hand man, I guess, at the time in MI6, had a close relationship with Protzer. And this all can't be proved, but I think it's a fairly sort of sound theory that there was some sort of level of cooperation going on between the British and the Germans in the mid-1930s before 1938 and before the sort of the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. And when Kim Philby defected in 1963 and Ellis was hauled into this interrogation in 1965, obviously any suggestion of kind of MI6 sort of collaborating with the Nazis in the mid-1930s was going to be frowned upon. And my belief, my personal belief, is that Ellis was really protecting Mingus from what he had been up to in the 30s. So for me, that explained what he was doing with his Nazi agents in the field, right? And the people that he was working with to get information about what was going on, on the Soviet side and the German side. I don't think that he had any nefarious intentions. I don't think he ever betrayed Britain. I think he was working for a noble cause, but I think he probably made a mistake at one point of accepting some money and taking it. But if you look at kind of the salaries of MI6 agents in the field at that time, they weren't paid enough, yet they were expected to kind of pay their sources for information. So I don't think you really could blame Dick Ellis for perhaps sort of trousering some money at that point. And I don't think he should be, yes, it was a mistake, but I don't think sort of if you're judging judging him on the breadth of his career that he should be condemned for it.
So we know that he definitely took money, or this is just a hunch?
This is supposedly what he confessed to in this interrogation in 1965, but we do not have a transcript of this confession. All we have is the say-so of Peter Wright that Ellis had confessed to passing information on to the Nazis, right? And what's happened is that this supposed confession from Ellis that he passed some information on to the Nazis has suddenly sort of, just expanded into, sort of Dick Ellis being responsible for everything bad that happened during the war. That he's been blamed for all these things that he had absolutely nothing to do with. And essentially, it's all coming from one man, which is Peter Wright. So when I started looking at, the substance of sort of what Peter Wright was accusing Ellis of, in Spycatcher, he says, I was reading this biography, this autobiography of this widow of a Russian spy, and it was like the first clue that I had that Ellis had been up to no good, and this was okay. So if he's reading this book about this Russian spy, and it contained the first clue of Dick Ellis, it must have happened around the time of his interrogation, but this book was published like 4 years later. So immediately there was something wrong with, Peter Wright's information in this book. It just didn't stack up. And the more, that I went through it, I felt like, the actual sort of substance of what Wright was accusing Ellis of was flimsy. There's another explanation for it, which was that MI6 at a very high level had basically told Dick Ellis, work with the Nazis. Our common enemy at that time is the Soviet Union. That's what, we're going to cooperate with the Germans on this. And then all of a sudden, after, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and the world was sort of hurtling towards war, things changed.
Mm-hmm. So this is what he's accused of, taking money. I guess just briefly, so that we have time to go through some other stuff. He's accused of this, but how flagrant a transgression is that? Because, we could go to Robert Hanssen or Aldrich James and say, well, they took money, but within the context of their career, they shouldn't be judged on that. But some things cross a line that should never be crossed by someone that's in that particular field. So how common was taking money, if indeed he did take money, at that time for MI6 officers? Well,
number one, it was an isolated incident, whatever it was. It wasn't like this was a pattern of behaviour. Mm-hmm. And he hadn't been doing it for a long time like a Hanssen, and it certainly wasn't pocketing $200,000 or anything like that. It was a small amount of money. Supposedly it was it helped pay his wife's medical bills, and
his ex-wife, because
his ex-wife, yes. Yeah. So the sister of the fellow called Alexei Zelensky. Hopefully you're following all this because it's very complicated. But it was a small amount of money. Agents were paid a pittance. It usually came out of salaries at the Passport Control Office. So they weren't given enough money basically to do the jobs that they were asked to do, which was to get information from their network of kind of double agents and triple agents in the field. And I've had this conversation with my girlfriend about if you were an undercover cop sort of working on a drug case and you're pretending to be a drug dealer, right, and you sell some drugs, are you going to refuse money if someone pays it to you? No. it's the same sort of thing if you're a spy in the field and you're pretending that you're on this person's side. Of course you might take some money.
You have to live the cover.
You've got to live, the role.
Mm-hmm.
So in the absence of any real kind of substance, and evidence against Ellis, all we have is the say-so of kind of Peter Wright that this is what Ellis confessed to. And it doesn't really make any sense.
So the issue here is that he's interrogated by MI5, MI6, but the transcript of that interrogation is still classified, so we don't know what was said other than by second-hand reporting.
Yeah, and also you have to ask, Nigel West, he wrote his own book, containing the Ellis story, and he has his own sources, which come obviously from within the intelligence services of Britain. But who's feeding him the information? What are their motivations? There are a number of reasons for people wanting to kind of claim another scalp. It could be that people were incredibly embarrassed by their failure to detect Kim Philby while he was sort of working right under their noses, and there were a lot of people who were incredibly embarrassed and mortified by that, and obviously wanted to atone for it. So they were looking for other Russian moles, essentially, to kind of, justify their continued employment.
Mm-hmm. So I think to go through the rest of the charge sheet. So he's accused of taking money, selling information, and working on behalf of the Nazis. And then the theory is that the Soviets find out that he's done this, so then he gets blackmailed to provide them with information. So that's the rest of the charge sheet. And the evidence for the prosecution and the defence is laid out in much greater detail in the book, which I would encourage you to buy, obviously. And I think that we should probably go over to questions, and I think if you want to find out the rest of the story, the best place to do so is in the book. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very elaborate story, which isn't easily kind of summarised. But I think you'll find, if you read the book, that you'll probably come to the same conclusion that I do, hopefully, that I'm 95% convinced that he was innocent. I can't say categorically that he was innocent, but I'm pretty sure that he was. And
would you bet your mortgage on it?
Yes, I would.
Okay. That's a lot of confidence.
Yeah.
Amanda?
Yeah, well, I want to encourage our in-person folks to go to the standing mics. I have an online question already, but I do want to say, Andrew, you were asking about BSC agents operating in D.C., and we have a very favorite one. I do, Betty Pack. So look into Betty Pack if you're interested in a kind of salacious BSC operative. But I love her dearly. She's a very amazing woman. So this is a question that I had myself, but from one of our online guests. When is the interrogation transcript anticipated to be declassified?
I don't think it will ever be declassified.
Yeah, I think that British intelligence, like MI6, they have this, which is not a terrible idea. They have this idea that in some parts of the world, it doesn't matter necessarily what you've done. Your family's reputation can still be stained, even if it was your great-grandparent.
That's right.
So the idea is that this is a way to protect not just the source, but the source's family legacy further down the line. So it may not, it could be, a couple of 100 years maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they close some files for, over 100 years. It's pretty insane.
Let's say 100 years.
That's God.
Yeah, good evening. Wonderful program. Pearl Harbor,
Yeah.
Popov, 6 months in advance of the attack, he knew or claimed he knew.
Yeah.
Any idea of what his sources were, and do the leaks come from the Russians, or what is your theory as to who was responsible for leaking this very sensitive information to him or whoever he hung out with? Thank you.
Popov was essentially given this sort of questionnaire, which was sort of hidden. There's this technology called microdot, where the sort of document can be sort of hidden. You need a special kind of magnifying glass camera to actually kind of read this, the information, the writing on this document. And he had sort of passed it on to Ellis and the FBI, and they had sort of had it translated, discovered that 40% of this particular document was asking about Pearl Harbor, and that Popov's job while he was in the United States was to gather as much information as he could about sort of the military installations at Pearl Harbor. And this was why Popov desperately wanted to kind of have this meeting with Hoover and tell him this is a clear kind of indication that the Germans, who were then sort of passing on information to the Japanese, were very interested in Pearl Harbor, and everything suggested that an attack was imminent. And so that's essentially the kind of the main source for this idea that an attack was imminent. It was what Popov was actually holding himself.
So the Germans was the source, you think?
Yes, the Abwehr, the military intelligence of Nazi Germany, had asked Popov to get this information. And so Popov was also working for the British, and this is why he had called this meeting in New York with the FBI to say, look, they have sent me out here to gather this information. Clearly, something's up. You should take this very seriously, and that's not what happened, obviously. So this was 3 or 4 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor.
So one question I don't want to dominate, which I'm doing, of course, is I thought that Germany and Japan were allies. So were the Germans spying on the Japanese? Is that what you're saying?
I think everyone was spying on each other, but essentially the Germans and the Japanese were allies at that time, and they were sharing intelligence. So the Abwehr was asking Popov to gather information, which then would have been sent on to the Japanese.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoyed the talk. Just to follow up, I have an actual question, but also I wanted to comment about Pearl Harbor. My understanding is that actually it was known that Pearl Harbor was one among many possible targets that the Japanese fleet was gearing up to attack, but that it was thought in the final analysis that they were more likely they were headed down into Southeast Asia to hit some of the major petroleum depots, and that it was the cleverness of the Japanese in their total silence as to where, radio silence, detection silence as to where the fleet was,
Right.
that enabled it to be such a surprise attack. So it's not that people didn't know Pearl Harbor was a possibility. It was considered the lesser of the possibility for good reasons.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful book called The Code Breakers by a fellow by the name of David Kahn. And in the first 100 pages of that, he goes through very meticulously the flow of intelligence regarding the whereabouts and the destination of the Japanese fleet. So it's a little more complicated. And I think every good ex-spy, World War II spy in Washington basically had a claim. I told them they were going to hit Pearl Harbor. So that's sort of good dining out story. But my question's a little more banal. Did Ellis have any children? Because it
Yes.
sounds like he had a couple of
Yes,
wives.
he had a daughter who is still alive today. She lives in New York, and I was given her email address by someone at the National Library of Australia, and it was answered by Ellis's granddaughter, and I explained what I was doing. And in the book, I actually sort of reproduced the response that I got, which was, leave us alone, never contact us again, and which was quite upsetting for me, because I felt like I'm trying to do the right thing here by your grandfather, but it was explained to me by this fellow called James Cotton, who had written an academic paper on Ellis, and who knew Ellis's daughter, that they had felt very let down by other journalists who had approached them in the past about Dick Ellis's story, and that they'd felt betrayed. So I didn't actually get access to his daughter, but who's now in her 90s. And I haven't spoken to the Ellis family since. I'm very tempted to sort of get her address and send her a copy and just say, look, this is what I came up with, and what do you think? But it was unfortunate that I didn't have her cooperation. But the great thing was that I was given sort of access to the archives of some people who did know her, and I sort of found information, letters that she had written regarding what had happened to her father and how incredibly sort of upset she had been. And she actually returned all his medals to the British government, and she was so sort of disgusted with the British and the way that they'd handled the case that she left Britain and came to New York, and I don't think she's ever gone back. So he also had a son who was born in Germany, and his name was Oleg. He also went by the name Peter, and he became a Canadian intelligence officer. But he died, I think, in 2012. So obviously I wasn't able to talk to him.
Interesting, thank you. And just to be clear, he was never formally charged, correct?
No.
They did an investigation, interrogation, and just sort of, that was the end of it.
And he was given a pension. Now, and I would say that if they're giving you a pension and you've been accused of being a Russian spy, it's a slightly sort of odd thing. And when he died, or just before he died, he was sent a sort of a happy 80th birthday card by the head of MI6, and people from MI6 attended his funeral. So if he was as bad as they make out, I don't think these things would have happened.
I second your recommendation of those 100 pages in David Kahn's book, Codebreakers, A Day in the Life of Purple. Purple's the Japanese diplomatic code. It's excellent. It almost reads like literature, I think.
Thanks for your talk. I've lived in Australia most of my life, and I hadn't actually heard of him until tonight.
Right.
I'm just wondering if that's because the Australian government are embarrassed by him, so they've played down his story, or I'm just a very uninformed person.
No, you're exactly like me. I had not heard of him either.
That's why you wrote the book.
That's why I wrote the book. And I thought, it's extraordinary that a country as small as Australia doesn't know anything about someone who came from Sydney, had this incredible sort of unusual background for a spy, and sort of got to the top of the spy game in Britain and in the United States. Australia was so highly regarded and had these incredibly serious accusations made against him. But, I would also say that I think it's embarrassing for the Americans too, that someone who was so critical to the establishment of their own spy agencies had these charges made against him. So, that might be a reason, that Americans don't know about Dick Ellis as well. So it's interesting. I think, yes, his sort of name has been a bit of an embarrassment for, you know, the intelligence agencies of sort of Britain, Australia, and the US.
Yeah, because I've read about the Petrov affair and just the early days of ASIO, and just out of interest, but I've just never seen his name previously.
Yeah, like I said, until my father had said, you know, check out Dick Ellis, I'd never heard of him either, and hopefully, you know, he gets some overdue recognition. I mean, that's what I'm hoping from this book. And, you know, in the absence of kind of conclusive evidence against him, I think he deserves the benefit of the doubt.
Thank you.
Question, when you were doing your research, did you check FBI files, do any Freedom of Information Act?
I sure did. Yeah.
And was there, I have the books coming tomorrow. I'm getting it
Right,
tomorrow,
right,
so I
right.
haven't had a chance to read it, but
No,
was there significant information in some
No.
of those requests that you can add?
No, I made a Freedom of Information request almost as soon as I started working on the book, and it took like a year and a half to get a response, and it said, you know, a thorough check was conducted and we found nothing, you know. So if there's anyone from the FBI or CIA here, please see me afterwards. I'd love to get some access to some documents, because I'm sure there's something.
We have one final online question to wrap it up. It's one we get a lot, but I love it. Who should play Dick Ellis in the movie?
That's a really good question. Oh, geez. I mean, he was white-haired, very short, rather fat. God, any suggestions? I can't think of anyone off the top of my head.
Jesse Plemons?
Sorry?
Jesse Plemons could go white-haired. I don't know.
Gosh. Sorry, who?
Yeah, it needs an
Russell Crowe would be
Australian.
perfect, because he's starting to look like Orson Welles. So, yeah, I'll go for Russell Crowe.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for such a compelling case that you built, and Jesse for supplying these extraordinary answers that will make everyone want to read more and feel, I think, sorry for Ellis. It sounds like he was badly maligned. It was great to have you all here. Jesse will be sticking around to sign books out in the hallway, answer any follow-up questions, thinking harder about who should play Dick Ellis. Our next program will be next Wednesday. It'll be strictly virtual, but it'll be a spy chat, current affairs at noon with Chris Costa and Kevin Higgins, who's on our board, as David Kahn was a founding board member here at the Spy Museum. So that is a great recommendation. So everyone, take care. Thank you for being with us, either in person or online.